Now, Scotland is not an Arctic nation, but it has a distinct economic, social, historic and political link to the Arctic countries, far more so than the rest of the UK. So, as the chill descends on the Brexit talks, is it time to try to formalise our relationship with our friends in the far north? This week, the First Minister addressed the Arctic Circle Conference meeting in Edinburgh. Here's Nicola Sturgeon in conversation with the former Icelandic Prime Minister, Olafur Ragnar Grimsson.
How can you see Scotland in the next 10 years enhancing this northern engagement of Scotland?
Well, firstly, I would agree with that. We increasingly look northwards as well as southwards in terms of looking to where we can make the biggest contribution. But I think the things we're talking about today will power, pardon the pun, power forward that relationship over the next 10 years and beyond, where we use our expertise and experience in areas like renewable energy, low carbon technology, and learn from what is being done here. Some of the developments we're talking about today, some of the implications of climate change for transportation and shipping, for example, just mean that we have to all think differently about this part of the world, and Scotland wants to be part of that and will increasingly look here in addition to the partnerships we have elsewhere as well.
Well, joining us now, the broadcaster and author Lesley Riddoch, who is the director of the policy group Nordic Horizons, which exchanges expertise between the Nordic countries and Scotland, and Graham Hogg of Lateral North, a research and design company which works with communities in Scotland and the Arctic region. Good morning to you both. Thanks very much for joining us. Lesley, to be blunt about this, what's in it for Scotland? Is it going to make us happier or more prosperous if we look north and have formal ties?
Well, we'd probably be looking north. I mean, I think when you start looking north, what you start to do is go a bit green with envy, actually, because you see small, even devolved governments with extraordinary power and very good infrastructure. I mean, anyone who's cruised up on the Hurtigruten to the very north of Norway will be gobsmacked at the bridges, tunnels and general support for their communities. If you look at the Faroes, they have the world's fastest mobile 4G coverage, which goes right to the edge of their fishing limit of 200 miles and up to the helicopters that service that fleet, including 18 of barren, remote little islands stuck between Shetland and Iceland. And that's mostly because their government was able to order their own telecoms company to produce a very bespoke solution for the Faroes. So they're way ahead of everybody. Oil, we've got the same problems as Norway and the same dilemma. Do we leave the oil in the ground? Are we confident enough about the rest of renewables? That's a conversation we can have with folk who've got the same level of capacity with renewables. It's sometimes harder to have within the UK. And the big thing, of course, will be the effect of climate change opening up a northeast passage, which makes a week faster shipping across to the Far East, and which has already had massive investment from the Finns and the Chinese, who are currently building a 100-kilometre railway connecting the Baltic and the Barents. Well,
Lesley, we'll look at that, the potential trade, shipping routes and all this in a moment. But just before we leave this idea, Lesley, of increased prosperity, we don't have Norway's oil fund, but equally we don't have the tax and spend structures that they have in the Nordic countries. Do you think there has to be a change in the political mindset in Scotland? And actually, how far can that realistically go in the present constitutional settlement?
Yeah, that's all the kind of the big questions, really. The Nordic model is high wages, high costs, high prices, and high personal taxes, though actually not high company taxes. That requires a lot of trust. The trust levels in the Nordic countries are the highest in the world, and that means you pay 45% income tax, but you know you will get the best kindergarten care from 1 till 7. You'll get the best old folks care in the world. You'll have a welfare state that doesn't tax people with dementia and try and take their disabled cars off them. You're paying for a welfare state in which you, as a relatively well-off person even, don't need to double down with private cover.
But that's a conversation we don't have at the moment.
We can't have this because it seems to be a kind of, well, that's related to independence, and of course that gets you into heavy water. You'll have to start ticking boxes right as I speak now for balance. So you can't get into some of the big offer things that come with being able to shift the balance. But to be fair, that trust has to be earned really by governments showing that they can deliver and spend money on what people want. The Scots have got a higher trust rating at the moment than anyone else in the UK.
Graham Hogg of Lateral North, when you look to the potential here, Do you see it as about Scotland reimagining the kind of country it could be and looking beyond the land borders, as it were? Lesley's talked about the sea routes that could be very important to trade, green energy. Do we have to reimagine what Scotland could be? And do you think people are willing to do that?
Yeah, I think so. We've been working now for 4.5 years on this sort of idea of Scotland being within the north, and if you just look at like a lot of the remote communities within, even we've been working out in Alaska, so a lot of the remote communities out there have a lot of similar challenges as ones within Scotland do. So how can we sort of have that shared knowledge and shared design challenges effectively? And in terms of housing or tourism or green energy, or what are the sort of areas you would cover? I mean, there's quite a lot. We've even been working in Anchorage, so it's like a very diverse city. It's got there's one community that has over 100 different languages spoken within it. So if you look at Scotland being this sort of diverse nation as well, then we can begin to have that look to have that sort of same conversation about how cities work. But I think like the remote communities and the sort of the challenges that they have in terms of housing are huge. So we've been we're an architecture practice first and foremost. So we've been working with those communities to develop housing solutions and develop master plans, but built from a community perspective rather than being sort of something that is government driven. That it's actually built from the community up. Yeah, Lesley, we were talking earlier, we have the constitutional settlement that we have, but do you think there is scope for, we can't renegotiate trade deals and we can't renegotiate all sorts of other things in terms of access to waters and what have you, but Lesley Riddoch, is there room for some sort of formalised agreement between Scotland and the Arctic countries that could cover things like access to trade routes, green energy, tourism?
Well, as I understand it, we can't do that. The Arctic Circle is a governing body for the 8 Arctic nations, and the UK has got observer status on that. Now, there's no reason why the UK delegate to that shouldn't be a Scot. And when you begin to knock about with a lot of the smaller states, you find that it's very customary for them to be able to take their country's seat. So the Faroes very often represents Denmark in the Arctic Circle. Quebec in Canada very often represents Canada. So you begin to understand there's a normal pattern from which actually Britain is kind of currently deviating. And there's more informal stuff that can be done. There's nothing to stop, for example, Fisheries Scotland talking to the Fisheries Department of Norway right now, because right now we have those devolved powers and we share those waters.
Yeah, but it's also a competitive relationship.
It is. It may be seen like that, actually. But, I mean, most of the people who are right at the kind of sharp end understand there's no point being competitive about a shared fishery, that doesn't observe any borders. So we could be doing quite a bit now by just getting in there and sharing expertise. There's already a lot of shared work going on about marine science, for example, that's quietly, potentially, finding the next set of antibiotics in the Arctic.
Lesley, just before we leave this idea about the Constitution, though, and I accept this is speculating about a hypothetical, but if there were an independent Scotland, do you think that if you had closer ties with the North, then you can redress the balance in terms of, or take a different balance in looking at going into the European Economic Area, as Iceland and Norway have done, instead of trying to rejoin the EU straight away? I mean, are those the sort of questions that might come up in the future? And that's another reason why we need to be looking north.
Well, yes. And I mean, the small northern states look at Scotland as a sleeping giant, because we may, in a UK context, we may feel small at 5 million, but compared to 40,000 on the Faroes or 300,000 in Iceland, we're enormous. Those countries, Iceland and Norway, opted out of the EU and into EFTA, which is another free trade body, because of the common fisheries policy. 90% of Iceland's income relies on fish. They were not going to let the rest of the EU fisheries in there. So that then created the EEA, the European Economic Area, which lets these guys pay up to 98% of full membership. It's a lot of money to be able to access the single market but not be governed by the common fisheries or agricultural policy and not have to join the customs union. For an independent Scotland, that could be useful, because if Britain does continue with Brexit, it means that we wouldn't necessarily be having a different kind of border of the type there is in Ireland.
Yeah, and Graham, just some final thoughts from you in terms of Scotland's interest in looking north. Do you have concerns that a lot of the interests now are quite exploitative of Arctic areas, of minerals, and there's quite a power play in terms of territorial grabs there and territorial interests there?
Yeah, I think that's quite a major issue that will come up in the future in terms of how you actually make sure that the Arctic is sustainable rather than it being something that is exploited. So I think in terms of where Scotland can contribute to that is really focused around the renewable energy. And how like our experience of having EMEC, for example, in Orkney, how we can use that experience to then shared experience with other Arctic nations and communities throughout the north to focus on renewable technologies and develop that within the Arctic region.
And tie into their physical links and infrastructures as well, potentially out of Scotland.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, if you look at the North Sea grid as like an idea of actually having energy that's sent out to from Scotland to the rest of Europe, then in terms of actually connecting in the geothermal power from Iceland, for example, would be one example of really using that to its full potential.
Okay, Graham, thanks for that. Graham Hogg there of Lateral North, and before that, Lesley Riddoch. Thank you both very much indeed.